Can I just, for clarification, that the date today is the 30th of January, not 22nd, as Chair just said.
Sorry, maybe I should start all over again. Last week was the 20th. We had a meeting last week on the 20th. I'm so sorry about this, folks.
Okay, and no apologies have been received. And can I ask members to note the list of offices held by the Assembly members and ask if there are any additional declarations of interest?
Noted, yeah.
Item 3, summary list of actions. Can members note the ongoing and completed actions highlighted on agenda item 3?
Noted.
And now I'm just going to move to item 5, which is responses to the rapporteur reports, designed, sealed, delivered, the contributions of off-site manufactured homes to solving London's housing crisis. And if I could ask members to note the Mayor's response to the final report as attached at Appendix 1.
Noted.
To note a letter sent to the government, signed by 4 of the Assembly party groups, urging support for off-site manufactured homes, attached at Appendix 2. And ask members to note the Secretary of State for Housing, Communities and Local Government's response to the issues raised in the report, attached at Appendix 3.
Chair,
I wanted to just raise something on that.
Yes.
I was quite disappointed with the Mayor's response with regard to setting up the panel that, as requested in the report, that would push forward modular housing off-site production. I think unless there's somebody there within the organisation that's pushing for this, it's not going to get done.
I'm glad you raised that. First thing I wanted to say was that
it's a great report, instantly. So, congratulations. I thought it was a brilliant, absolutely brilliant report, and absolutely reflects what the committee is.
Thank you for that.
Just a little.
Yeah, I led on that report on behalf of the Planning Committee, and in fact, we've had a lot of very good responses from it. And the Mayor's letter is actually broadly very supportive. And one of the things that I think is excellent about the response is that he has, at our instigation, reopened the Innovation Fund, which means that more precision manufacturers all over the country will be able to, as long as they're going to send their products to London, could be getting receipt of funds. They can certainly apply. And the letter from the Minister, Sajid Javid, is also broadly welcoming the work, which is good. But the of our recommendations, the only one that really isn't being pushed forward is the one that Andrew mentioned. We wanted to set up an independent advisory panel with obviously somebody executive in this building pushing that forward, because the consultants and the boroughs, in fact, who may be very keen to move this forward, need a certain amount of hand-holding and expertise. So I think we'll push forward on that, Andrew.
If perhaps we could write back to the Mayor and say, look, this is how do we know this is going to get done if there's not somebody militating for it?
Yeah, I mean, of course, the Mayor's staff really are pushing this, but this is to help the whole industry, having an independent advisory panel.
Perhaps we could give the Mayor a list of names of people that he's likely to be keen to work with, and appoint somebody who's already working on this.
Yeah, we could do that. They have to be a range of experts, obviously, because, and particularly, they've got to cover the whole range, the whole life cycle of modular housing, including financial due diligence, which I think is a very important aspect of it, because we want more lenders to come in.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for your work, Chair.
Okay, right, thank you on that. Ozzy, would you continue?
Okay, and now looking at item 6, Planning Committee Work Programme, can I ask members to please note the report that sets out progress on the work programme and to delegate authority to the Chair in consultation with the Deputy Chair to agree the subject for the main agenda items for the committee's meetings on the 28th of February and 14th of March 2018.
Noted.
And to state that the next meeting of the committee is scheduled for Wednesday, 28th of February 2018 at 2 p.m. here in Committee Room 5.
Agreed. And now we can go back to our main item.
Then, yes.
Which is item 4. Item 4.
On the draft London plan.
Right. Okay. So as I said earlier, this committee is responding on behalf of the whole Assembly to the Mayor's consultation draft, and this is the second of 2 meetings that we're having. though we have a whole body of evidence from many, many, many previous planning committee meetings. And of course, the other committees are also going to give us evidence because they're also looking at the draft London plan. Our first panel today is on London's heritage, its historic fabric, its views, its built environment, its conservation areas. And also we might touch on its natural heritage, the river. The second panel is on open space, which of course also overlaps with the natural heritage. So before we go into our questioning panel, it would be a good idea, I think, for each of you to introduce yourselves so that those people who are watching can know who you are. Just could you give us just one line about what you do and who you represent, starting at that end?
My name's David English. I am Historic Places Principal at Historic England. I lead a team of planners involved with the London Plan for about the last 18 months. We've also been involved with the UNESCO mission to Westminster last February and worked with the boroughs looking at their planning policy.
Very succinct, thank you.
I'm Chloe Clay. I'm team lead for urban design and development at Kingston Council. I lead up a team of 6 different specialists advising on planning applications and also delivering in-house supplementary planning guidance.
I'm Charles Wagner. I'm a heritage and planning consultant. I am the co-chair of the Spatial Planning Advisory Group of the Heritage Alliance. The Heritage Alliance is England's largest coalition of independent heritage interests. It was set up to promote the central role of the non-governmental movement in the heritage sector. We unite 113 organisations which together have over 7 million members, volunteers, trustees and staff. And indeed, the vast majority of England's historic environment is owned, managed and cared for by Heritage Alliance members.
Oh, okay, thank you.
My name is Michael Coop. I used to be Head of Planning and Regeneration at the former English Heritage. I'm now so distant from that job I'm practically listable myself. I am a freelance consultant. I work mainly pro bono. I like to think on side of the good guys. Otherwise, I sell antiquarian books.
I think we're also interested in your role on the London Forum.
Yes, sorry.
I think that's very important because we want to have a spread of
Yes.
expertise, including people who are actually meeting and working with people who are
Yes. I'm on
extraordinary
the planning,
citizens.
Yeah, I'm on the Planning and Transport Committee of the London Forum,
Thank you.
which represents all the civic societies around London.
Thank you.
Good morning, I'm Nairita Chakraborty. I'm the Principal Conservation Officer at Haringey Council. I've been working in the field of conservation and urban design for over 11 years. I worked in 3 different local authorities, 2 of which have been within London.
Thank you all for that. Right, now we're going to the 2 panels, and we want to close this session at about 11:30, just so you're aware of the time. We have a lot of questions, but we want everyone to be very succinct. And today, we're not having general statements about things. What we're trying to do is to look at the plan, say what's good about it, but particularly the meeting is mainly about, are there areas that we want to improve? And our experience has been that if something is very important, it ought to be in the policy box. If it's in the text, however good it is, if it's not reflecting a policy, then it doesn't actually have anything like the material consideration or weight of a policy in the box, just so everyone's aware of that. We're going to start with the World Heritage Sites, and with Tony Devonish, who is a councillor for Westminster. So who better?
Thank you, Chair. If we start with Mr. English and work our way down, please. In relation to the London's World Heritage Sites, how do you view UNESCO's concerns that there are challenges from incremental development that will put them at risk potentially?
I think fundamentally we agree that incremental development is a challenge. The policies in the new London Plan make reference to cumulative impacts and the need to assess them, which is really welcome. That's a positive step. Responding directly to the recommendations of the monitoring mission. However, there are 1 or 2 points, if you read across the plan, which are particularly relevant to World Heritage Sites. As I'm sure you'll know, at Westminster, a lot of the problems which drew the mission there in the first place related not to Westminster itself, but to opportunity areas in Vauxhall Nine Elms and at Waterloo. So it's the opportunity area policy that we've particularly picked up on as being a bit of a concern for treatment of World Heritage Sites, and where we think there needs to be perhaps some changes to the policy. This is particularly relevant with the opportunity area near the Great West Corridor in Hounslow, which is very close to Kew. There's likely to be a public inquiry later this year for a tall building which is in that area and could affect the World Heritage Site at Kew. And within the opportunity
It's a curve.
It is the curve, yes. Within the opportunity area policy, there's a line which says about opportunity areas being allowed to define their own character and density, which seems quite a strong push towards very tall buildings that pay no regard to their context. So I think that's something from our perspective that we would want to see adapted, changed, so that there is some recognition of context, so that you don't get situations where you have very tall buildings in the setting of World Heritage Sites which spoil their outstanding universal value.
So you think we need to look at that part of the London plan?
Yes.
Right.
Do you have any wording for that? Not now, but you can. The
We
point
can
the chair
provide-
didn't make, that we are going to make, if you can provide short written evidence afterwards, that would be really helpful.
Oh, well done, Tony. Yes, I should have said that.
Be very happy to do that.
Thank you. Ms. Clay, did you want to comment?
Kingston doesn't actually have any World Heritage Sites within it, so...
I don't think everyone needs comment.
No. Okay, I'll move on to my second question, which is fairly similar to number one. What, in your view, on UNESCO's fears that despite the London plan and Borough plan policies, there is, I quote, there is a disconnect between the good intentions of the policies, the buildings that are being constructed, end of quote, which negatively impact on London's heritage? Similar to the first question, but Mr. English, have you got anything else to add?
I think this is really about implementation, and it definitely applies across the built environment for London's heritage, so I think it's one which is relevant to everyone. In terms of improving implementation, that was an issue with the previous or the existing plan. We commissioned various pieces of research, and one of which said some of the policies in the current plan aren't that bad, but the implementation hasn't been very good. In terms of improving that implementation, having a clearer steer from the Mayor about the types of development he wants to see would be helpful. There are some really great words in the plan about heritage, but there are places where he could be clearer. Mayoral decisions, again, they send a very clear signal to industry about what will be acceptable, what won't be acceptable. I think we'll get on to later the key performance indicator, but that is a very positive thing potentially to help with implementation and making sure that that's monitored. But I think from our perspective, having something like an SPG, having a heritage strategy, will be really helpful with implementation, because again it will let boroughs know, it will let neighbourhood forums know, it will let civic groups know, it will let developers know what the Mayor's position is in a bit more detail, what he thinks, how he thinks people should be approaching the historic environment in the kind of, not just in the kind of overview that you can get in a policy like a plan like this, but in the everyday.
Would it help the sorry, Tony, I was just
No,
thinking,
please.
would it help the boroughs to have a heritage, for the Mayor to have a heritage SPG?
From Kingston's point of view, it would do,
Yeah.
yeah.
Sorry?
Definitely, yes. An SPG in heritage will really help us, because we are suffering from severe resource cuts and we just do not have the resources to make a heritage SPG for ourselves. We are struggling just to update our conservation area appraisals, to be honest, and we are starting to add design guidance to each and every appraisal that we are making, just as a short guidance to give people, residents and developers, etc., to give an idea about what kind of development may be acceptable on what sites. But that is just an appraisal, part of the appraisal. That's not something that we can then take to an appeal, for example. It doesn't have as much weight. So an SPG would be really helpful, I think.
Yeah, and if it covered small sites as well, so incremental changes, I think are one of the, I know we're going to cover small sites, but for Kingston in particular, half of our housing
Getting onto
is
small sites.
but it's the impact on the heritage assets of those small sites. So it's not just about doing something for a new site or next to a heritage, but it's also the smaller site, so guidance, on that is also important.
Guidance on that. I'll move on to my question. Just the question I was going to ask was about how, and I think I'll come back to the heritage strategy on this. How does the Mayor's strategic objectives, he calls them good growth policies, but how do they correlate in a way with the NPPF on heritage?
It's a big question.
Is it a useful question?
It's a very key question, actually.
Okay.
Yeah. From Historic England's perspective, there's been some really good progress on bringing good growth together with sustainable development. When we did our report on good growth, that was one of the things we wanted brought out, this very strong link between the two. The key thing in the NPPF is that heritage has got a very clear place, a very strong level of protection as part of sustainable development. It's kind of tied through, and then every time you read things like environmental in the plan, you understand exactly what that means. At the moment, this London plan, the glossary has got a definition of sustainable development which is just very slightly different to that in the NPPF. The NPPF has one for planning specifically, so it talks about economic, social, environmental including the historic environment, and it makes reference to a 2005 document that DEFRA put out. The London plan only makes reference to the 2005 document that DEFRA put out, which focuses more on the natural environment. So in terms of changes, one of the things we'd like to see is a change to that glossary definition from which lots of other things flow. In relation to the good growth policies, there's a reference to local character in, I think it's Good Growth Policy 2. There's a reference to the economic value of heritage in Good Growth Policy 5. Perhaps the bit which is missing is a reference to the social value, what heritage means to Londoners, to their identity, the identity of the city, which you might be able to get into Good Growth Policy 1, something about identity, something about sense of place. These are things which are why Londoners want to live here and why they care about their city, why people visit from all over the world. And that's maybe not brought out as much as it could be at the moment. So I think we would say the links are there, but they just need tweaking and tightening up so that you've got everything covered robustly going forward.
That's interesting, actually. The social value point has been brought up to me in other interests, really in relation to other topics too. Does anyone else want... yes, well, the heritage strategy, does the NPPF say there should be a heritage strategy?
Paragraph 126 says local planning authorities should set out in their local plan a positive strategy for the conservation and enjoyment of the historic environment, including heritage assets most at risk through neglect, decay and other threats. In doing so, they should recognise that heritage assets are an irreplaceable resource and conserve them in a manner appropriate to their significance.
Irreplaceable resource. It's a nice phrase. Okay, so... And you think that should be, that's the local development plans, but you think the the Mayor should also have a heritage SPG?
Indeed, as the government has done with
at a strategic level.
Yeah. Indeed, as the government has done with their own heritage statement issued last December, which was one designed to be taken on board by all government departments. So the government expecting the next level down, strategic planning level, to do it, and then local authorities to do it.
Right. Has anyone else got a comment on this? You don't have to have one. Okay. The other thing is KPIs, key performance indicators. They're very important for monitoring. Is the KPI what you'd like to see? Do you want us to kick off, David?
I can answer that one again, I think. Generally, yes. I think the new KPI will do something that the existing one, which relates to heritage, won't. The existing one relates only to heritage at risk, which is about 5% of heritage assets in London, and those which are most at threat. It's something that we at Historic England monitor every year, and it doesn't make any calls on the GLA and on the Mayor in terms of what he does and what the authority does. The new KPI will look at the trend in terms of if applications are generally making positive impacts on heritage, or if they're generally making negative impacts on heritage. And assessing essentially how GLA are reviewing heritage and the decisions they're making on it.
Will it mean that strategic planning applications, which are considered by the Mayor, as well as local?
It's only ones being looked at by the Mayor to start with. However, we are doing some work ourselves on developing a similar performance measure with our advice. So if you've then got the two sets of advice, you can see how GLA decisions compare to the government's advisor on heritage. That's quite a powerful tool then to see if you're getting the right types of decision on this issue from City Hall.
Right. Any other members of the panel want to make a comment?
Could I make a sort of general comment about the whole of the World Heritage side of the plan? It seems to me that from the outside, that there's quite a bit of satisfaction about the policies, as we thought they were generally good, and in the last plan as well. But the problem has always been implementation and enforcement. When it comes down to it, particularly the previous administration, the interventions were generally to overturn refusals rather than actually be more restrictive. So it seems to me that this administration has got to set an example to show that the Mayor is prepared to intervene when the boroughs are intending to do something that's contrary to policy. What I would like to see is a tightening up of the wording. There's a lot of shoulds, shall I say, in this plan, and I wonder whether they shouldn't be musts or shoulds, musts or be required to, all that sort of thing. I'd like to see the wording tightened up, and indeed quite a lot of us feel that the NPPF is a bit weak. Sustain and enhance, and the word preserve actually appears in the legislation. And remember that the 1990 Act, with the duties for listed buildings and conservation areas, the wording is very different. It's preserve or enhance. And now we've gone through, some cases it's conserve, some cases it's sustain. And I noticed that the definition in the glossary is a good one.
Is what?
But I just feel that there's a perception that it's a bit weaker than it might have been in the past.
So that's interesting. So let me just, which trumps which? Does the Act, the legislation, that's 1990, is it?
Yes. The 1990 Act.
Does that trump NPPF?
Yes.
Yes.
And that puts a duty on local authorities to have special regard to the desirability of preserving the building or its setting, and for conservation areas, it's about special attention shall be paid to the desirability of preserving or enhancing the character or appearance of that area.
I mean, the only plus, I've set this out in an email to Paul, so I have explained, and perhaps I'll do something else afterwards to make it even
Do
more
send us
explicit.
in extra wording if you want to.
Yeah, I mean, I just think that the wording in the Act should trump really what is appearing at the moment in guidance.
You're saying it's contradictory at the moment? Or,
It's not
or
strong
just
enough.
not strong enough?
Not strong enough.
No, see, it's sustain and conserve rather than preserve and enhance, which is rather stronger, isn't it?
Yes, there is a plus in that in the wording in the London plan has and, so it is conserve and enhance. And if you look at the legislation, it's or. So you could say that's a little bit weaker. So it's swings and roundabouts, really.
It's hard to enhance if you're not preserving, but still.
Yeah, but you know what I mean. Yeah.
I'm not quite sure. But anyway,
preserve
anyway, we
means-
get the message. We get the
Preserve
message.
means to prevent from causing harm.
Yeah,
That's what it
I might ask it now, actually. Any of you who've compared the language in other parts of the plan, do you think then that the historic heritage, historic fabric, etc., is not quite as strongly protected or preserved or enhanced as other parts of the plan? Does anyone want to comment on that?
I think there's a should appears pretty consistently throughout the plan, actually. So, I mean, you might want to consider where you want to have a bit more of an emphasis, say must or shall.
Just looking at the green environment policies, almost every one is should be protected. And you go through it, policy after policy, it's very clear. And in the good growth policies at the beginning, I think it's good growth policy 2, with the historic environment, the wording in itself is good. Understand what is valued about existing places and use this as a catalyst for growth and placemaking, strengthening London's distinct and varied character. That's a positive approach to heritage. With the green environment, protect London's open spaces, and then a list of things, which is very straightforward, very clear. Now, I think we want heritage to be engaged with positively, but a tightening up of words is the type of thing where that sends a clear sign about how the administration want to use this issue.
Would you send us in examples of where you think the wording should be stronger in terms of
make
protection?
a general point, Chair, is that it seems to me throughout this chapter,
the culture, the heritage chapter.
Yes, the heritage chapter. Heritage is seen as a civilising element to development proposals produced from elsewhere. What I would like to see in the plan also is a recognition that heritage-led regeneration is a tool that should be used, particularly when you're looking at intensification in the suburbs, because the historic environment provides some sort of a template for showing you how you can get mixed uses, people living and working and playing within a short compass, all those sorts of things, squares, terraces, mansion blocks, the sort of fairly dense development you get in areas like North Kensington, which are still civilised urban living and might just be more palatable to the boroughs, who are of course gearing up at the moment to have a revolt against the GLA because they feel that their houses and gardens are going to be threatened by intensification. I think if you look at a heritage-led approach, you might be able to have a little bit more acceptance.
And indeed, that's what's in the present plan policy 7.9, heritage-led regeneration, which I think has been diluted by taking parts of it and moving it around.
It's not a policy at the moment, it's just a paragraph, isn't it?
Was it in the previous plan, was it a policy?
We're suggesting to convert that into a policy, yes.
Heritage-led regeneration. I think that's really important because we'll come to it, I think, when we talk about small sites, and I think Andrew's going to, I don't know who's going to talk about, one of you is going to ask questions about this, but since small sites include conversion and demolition, I think a case has to be made, not in every case, for refurbishment.
Yes.
I don't know, we ought to get on to that, I think.
Yes, sustainability, let's face it, actually means making the best use of existing urban fabric. And perversely, of course, the VAT rules at the moment say that if you want to repair or maintain your building, you pay 20% VAT. If you knock it down and build something new, it's zero rated, and that's been a bone of contention for many years. And we'd quite like the Mayor to help the rest of us take this up with government.
Yeah. It overlaps also with the environment, because it means then you're, you know, until we actually have policies on embodied energy, embodied carbon, you're not going to really be able to see the value sometimes of refurbishing. Anyway, should we park that and maybe come back to it? But
I have a small point to make about that. In the design policies, actually, the plan actually does talk about circular economy, and I think that is where we can actually talk about refurbishing buildings and reusing them rather than, they don't have to be listed, they don't have to be in the conservation area. The idea should be that if there is a building that I can use, my first priority should be how I can retrofit it rather than let's demolish it because I want a very big building here. I think that needs to come out clearly, and perhaps not in the heritage policies, but definitely there's scope to put that in the design policies, because it's already talking about reusing fabric and circular economy and using materials that can prolong, you know, they have longevity, etc. So I think that is one place that this can be included, perhaps.
So it's not sufficiently joined up. Which is the policy you mentioned?
Yes, I was just looking at it. It's the design policies and.
Well, if you
I
let
think
us know.
D2 or D1, somewhere between D1 and D2, it does talk about circular economy and how buildings should be. You know, they have long
Oh,
life.
I see. You're linking it to circular economy.
Yes, and I think that's where because I do feel that that sort of heritage is not just about designated assets. It's also about industrial warehouses and other buildings that have historic value but not necessarily designated. And local character perhaps will come back to that, but local character is much made of those kind of buildings. And that could be included in the design section of the plan.
Okay,
perhaps.
I think we've clocked that. That's good, thanks. Okay, I think I'm done with my question. So question 4?
Right, it's me. Thank you, Chair. I think this is a question primarily aimed at Marita, since it refers to the boroughs. How can boroughs manage the need to increase densities, even in areas that may be within conservation areas and town centres with historic local character?
Thank you. I think, well, on one hand, the plan is actually quite thorough in terms of recognising that every borough needs to understand its local context and character, but then it kind of contradicts itself by talking about intensification of small sites and town centres. And whilst on theoretically and ideally that is the right way forward, because I know in my borough the west of the borough is so saturated that we do not have any big sites, and we would be looking for smaller sites there for development. But the way the plan is set out is actually quite dangerous to the local character. It actually talks about from 1 to 25 sites that could be seen as a license to subdivide gardens and sell them for profit just for one small unit, and we've already struggled with it. In our plan, in the local plan that we have, the DMDPD, when we did our urban characterisation study, we actually realised that most of our town centres are Victorian, most of our suburbs or the residential areas, I wouldn't call them suburbs, but they are made of Victorian terraces or Edwardian terraces with really long, deep garden, and that is the main characteristic feature of Haringey as a borough. Now, if we start subdividing each of those gardens randomly, then that's going to be a very negative impact on the character. However, if you were to look for negative sites, particularly in town centres where you may be able to go taller, or within residential areas where you perhaps have a small garage site or a parking site that has been abandoned, and you identify that at a very early level, then you can probably go ahead and talk about how you can develop that site in the future. But I think putting that, just saying that 1 to 25 actually is quite dangerous. The other thing is there is a presumption towards demolition. And it says you have to be sensitive in the conservation areas, but I know for a fact that in Highgate, for example, which is a part of Haringey, the main character is large buildings in very large gardens. Now, how am I going to justify the demolition against provision of, say, 35 new flats? Obviously, that means that you are kind of agreeing with the London plan because you're optimising the land there and you're providing 35 new homes instead of one big mansion house. How am I going to, what is there for me to say? Because that demolition of one house doesn't necessarily mean harm to the whole of the conservation area, even if it is a conservation area. So I will struggle in an appeal situation to protect that character of that protected designated asset. So that is my fear. So I'm really worried about the small sites, and I think...
So, that's very... Sorry, Navid, I'm just thinking, in the large... I mean, I actually live in Highgate, so I know. But,
I'm just talking about the bishops, for example.
I was just wondering, the thing is, you have a conflict here, don't you? Because you have sometimes large buildings of absolutely no character whatsoever, so to speak, with large gardens. And what you're looking at really is the loss of open space then.
Yes, and that can actually...
And they could certainly take 20 houses.
Yeah, and that can actually have impact further on the diverse sort of natural habitats as well, because that's also not designated. When you have back-to-back rear gardens, then you have this, area where...
And also a larger scheme, how it will fit in with the rest of the character.
Yes, exactly.
It may not be historic or in terms of conservation kind of related, but certainly something which is very local and something which your community wants to see maintained.
Exactly, and that's like when we come back to social value point that we were discussing before. So I think if I were to then connect it to the local character bit that the policy includes in the design side of it, where it talks about the boroughs identifying area codes and design codes. Again, I'm really, really worried about that, because having done the urban characterization study, it was 3 of us, 2 urban designers and myself, who did that. It was a work for 2.5 years when we did that, and it was very onerous, and we only did a neighbourhood level plan. We only gave broad place principles for areas which we thought could be done better, which then informed our site allocations and other development plan documents. However, if the onus is now on to local authorities to go on to the fine-grained detail of what densities should be going where and where the small sites would be, that is extremely onerous, extremely resource-consuming, and I'm not sure whether any borough has the skill, because it's a skill-based thing. You have to employ specific urban designers, architect urban designers actually, and so I'm not sure whether any borough would be able to deliver that.
I have a supplemental here. I think I know what your answer is, but I'll pose it anyway, and then open it up for any comments from any of the panel members. And that is, does the new presumption in favour of developing smaller sites including conservation and demolitions in conservation areas, pose a risk to local heritage?
Yes, definitely. I definitely think that, yes.
Any comments?
I would agree with everything that's been said, particularly I know David's probably going to bring up the opportunity areas, which tend to be around stations for Kingston. All of our stations are going to be Crossrail 2 stations, and a lot of those areas haven't seen a lot of change, so there are a lot of Victorian, a lot of heritage assets around there, which will be huge swathes of change. And you know, in favour of development and housing numbers, you're always going to have that favour to knock it down and build something high, because it's optimising a site, it's doing all the things that the New London Plan is saying that we need to be doing, and not giving enough weight to heritage. And I think on the flip side of the garden aspect, whilst you may not notice it from the street, which tends to be the public viewing place, and therefore the impact at the back, there is no impact because you can't see it from the street. Actually, the impact on the natural space, so particularly with stormwater, surface water, all of those issues are going to be huge, and they impact on our urban environment. So I think some connection there needs to be made, which I don't feel is ever made within the London Plan.
Moving away from small sites, how will the focus on increasing densities in town centres, often, as you will see, through London Plan designation, opportunity areas in Outer London, boroughs, for example, and areas around stations, impact on protecting local significant heritage? David, you might.
I'd say I think the approach taken in this version of the plan, particularly to town centres, is far more coherent and far more sensitive to heritage than in the current London Plan, particularly after the last set of revisions, which talked about kind of wholesale redevelopment and was potentially very harmful. So I think in relation to town centres, the approach here is a good one, and one that actually could do to be picked up with the opportunity areas policy, thinking about densification around rail hubs and stations. But I think my colleagues here are right to put their finger on the small sites policy actually is perhaps the biggest threat to heritage. The kind of plan-led approach that this document is encouraging is a good one, I think, from our perspective. There are issues to do with resources, and that's where good guidance from GLA will be really helpful. But there are specific parts of the small site policy which, where it talks about demolition, where it talks about all applications can have a certain amount of harm to heritage, and that's automatically okay. Where it talks about only excluding statutory listed buildings. These are things which aren't in line with the Planning Act on listed buildings and conservation areas.
Not.
They are not.
So which policies are those?
This is in the small sites policy. It's parts E and F, which are
E and F of?
H2
H2.
are of particular concern.
Okay.
It's also not in line with the MPPF. So I think there are some bits of this policy which, if we were to prioritise changes, that would be for heritage, and this isn't thinking more broadly, those would be the changes that we would really focus on.
Do you think there's enough kind of measures within the policies to protect local heritage within those areas which will have much intensification within town centres? Because I can give you an example. I represent Borough of Harrow. Town centre development is obviously quite right in terms of that being an opportunity area. But then the controversy comes about when you see a landmark building which is sort of up on the hill, St. Mary's Church. Now that becomes a major issue of contention when you start looking at 20-story buildings coming up. Now, do you think that there is enough divergence, so to say, within the new plan to give that extra emphasis to make sure that local buildings or local kind of landscapes of value are protected? They may not be of architectural or conservation or heritage significance, though that's arguable itself. But this is something which is important in terms of local fabric. Do you think that there's enough in here to protect or additionally protect?
There are some additional protections for things like landmark church, if boroughs do the work on things like views. So there's some good words in the plan, which could be slightly stronger, but they're definitely a step in the right direction, about the weight given to local view protection. Now, if you think about kind of London strategically, the key things in the views are St Paul's Cathedral, Palace of Westminster. If you were to do that at a borough level, it could be St Mary's Church in Harrow, or an equivalent building. It needn't necessarily be listed.
Unfortunately, it's not done quite, because when you look at local, local sort of landmarks of character, they are not your strategic views, and therefore they do not take the same kind of strategic importance.
Well, I know that Kingston are certainly doing some great work on this.
I've got that coming up later on. Okay, if we can move on, I'm a bit mindful of time.
Kingston's done some great work.
On the view side of things, but I think you want to wait
No,
until
okay.
later. But
Might as well go on.
well, we're currently using a 3D model done by View City in Wagstaff. We have basically analysed all of our current views that we have locally, that we see as locally important. There were roughly 900 views that we looked at across the entire borough, and we used a 3D model alongside that to look at those, as well as doing site visits, and we've come up with 13 highly important views. We use the same language as that's come out in the London Plan, which is lucky. We've been working with Historic England on it. The GLA have been invited to join in on this, but haven't been as active as Historic England. And what we're planning on doing is having all of these views put into the View City model. What that allows is developers or ourselves to put developments in place and highlight those buildings, and take views from all across the borough, outside of the borough, because I know View City is currently working with I think they're working with the GLA or TfL to build a London-wide model, and that way you'll be able to see impacts from buildings outside of your borough. So it's allowing us to have a greater understanding of the impacts of new buildings or changes to buildings. And at the moment it's just a massing model, but obviously the more detail you can put into that, such as materials and things like that, will make a huge difference to those sort of longer, locally important views.
And heritage is a key part of that.
Absolutely.
Local landmarks.
I've got a policy-related question here. we got design policies D1 and D2 and heritage policy HC1 of the plan, which promote an evidence-led approach to identifying growth areas and appropriate types of development. Question is, can character analysis help deliver good growth?
Definitely. I mean, can I just make a general point? I mean, I know we're talking about heritage here, but for a long time, only conservation areas had character appraisals. And therefore, politicians, particularly national politicians, say, well, if it's outside the red-lined area, then the rules of the jungle apply.
Right.
We don't need to worry about anything really at all. Now, I think Kingston have set a fantastic example by characterising the whole of their borough. And what we'd like the GLA to do is to try to make sure that all the rest of the London boroughs have a borough-wide characterisation. And that will help because that gives you some guidance, particularly with the 3D models, as to what you can do in terms of intensification.
That's quite interesting, isn't it? Because then you could actually isolate. I mean, sometimes, you know, way outside of conservation areas, there could be a street or 3 streets,
Yes, absolutely.
which really are, you
Absolutely.
know, the sort of places that people really do identify with, part of the historic fabric. So that would do that. Isn't there another tool in the London plan that would do that? The area density or the area
codes,
design codes?
Area design codes. But then again, I think that was the point I was making before. The urban characterization study like Kingston that we did actually talk about place principles and advice on block patterns that could be appropriate for certain sites where we thought they could be improved in a way, especially in terms of permeability and movement and circulation patterns. The problem, however, was that we worked at a neighbourhood level. What this plan tends to suggest is to go at a finer detail of a much street by street level detail, and that is actually quite resource consuming, and that is where my worry is that before we can actually come up with that characterization study, there will be a queue of developers outside who would want to do that development first, and that is my biggest worry in this plan. It's really idealist, and I'm really, really glad that the London Plan actually requires that characterisation study, which was up until now was being, we were doing it because Historic England asked us to do it. We didn't do it because the London Plan asked us to do it. So I think it in a way strengthens it, but on the other flip side, it actually puts too much onus on the local authority, and I just do not know whether it is practicable.
Can I just clarify? Does the plan actually ask for characterisation studies?
The design, the D2, the policy D2 actually talks about initial evaluation, and it talks about to identify an area's capacity for growth, understand how to deliver it in a way which strengthens, etc., and it goes into details of what, in preparing development plans and area-based strategies, which covers the following elements. Now, your development plan is the development plan document, that is a borough-wide development plan. We did to... As
Can I just ask, does it actually say in that evaluation list, does it say characterisation studies?
Well, the things that it has picked up will be part of your characterisation study. For example, how the urban form, structure, transport networks, open space, historic evolution, heritage assets. These are the elements that we studied for the characterisation
It doesn't use the word.
Should it actually say it?
It doesn't
Perhaps,
specifically.
yes.
It doesn't
Perhaps.
specifically.
Shouldn't it
ask
say
it?
it?
No, it
Yeah.
doesn't.
Perhaps
Not
it
for
should.
borough. Not specifically for borough.
But should it say it?
Yes.
Yes, it should.
Okay, that's what we want to
definitely
hear.
say,
I want
yes.
to know.
It should say it because there is actually set out in the MPPF paragraph 170, where appropriate, the landscape character assessments should be prepared, integrated with assessment of historic landscape character, and for areas where there are major expansion option assessments of the landscape sensitivity.
That's text.
Yeah. Could I just say there's only one good thing about small sites, because I think, generally speaking, what has happened with housing policy nationally is that it's the big battalions that have done all the development, and the reason for that is that they're big enough to be able to offer some affordable housing, and the small stuff does offer an opportunity for local developers and local architects to actually, who live in the area, have to live with the consequences of what they produce, to maybe do rather better developments than you might have had otherwise. That's the only plus, I think.
It's also, there are sites, garage sites, and there are infra sites that would take housing.
Oh yes, yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
And it also means, it also offers 800,000 households with 2 or more bedrooms spare. Now, you know, often people want to downsize in their area but can't, and it offers that opportunity too. You can stay in your community perhaps. So there are quite a lot of pluses about this. It's just that we want to examine what are the threats and the risks as well. We don't want unintended consequences.
Now we want the heritage elements to be a lead in the regeneration process rather than targets for demolition.
Sure. Tony, you wanted to come in.
I just wanted to ask the Haringey officer, are there particular pinch points in terms of resourcing some of this work you're trying to do on heritage? Is there something you'd actually say to the GLA, this is where we're particularly struggling to resource this, particularly on the small site side?
I think in terms of design is we need so we have at the moment, I'm the only principal conservation officer, we've got an urban design officer, and to do the characterization study we asked Neil Double, guy had worked for Hounslow as well, so we asked him to come in and he was the lead on the urban characterization study. And the work that we did was in addition to me and Richard's regular work, so whilst Neil was full-time on this, me and Richard already have a really busy work schedule, and on top of that we had to do that. So it was 2.5 years, but the worry is also that with us, we did it at a neighbourhood level. We did it at 1 is to maybe 50,000 scale, but the plan requires it to look at 1 is to 500 scale, which is...
Are you going to write to the GLA and say, because they've made that change, there will be an additional cost of having one more FTE at least? I mean, are you pushing these points back to the GLA? Because they're very good at pushing everything down to the boroughs.
Yes.
And I do hope that both Kingston and Haringey and the others are pushing stuff back up.
Yes, this is resource is definitely an issue that I definitely would raise.
On this whole capacity issue, which is a big concern, to be honest, I mean, I can see sense where you want boroughs to take that leading role because it's to do with local character and all of that. But question is that given that there is capacity issue already, how can both London Plan as well as GLA can help the boroughs?
I think guidance, when we talked about it, sorry, I think David wants to say anything. I was just going to say guidance.
I'd say in addition to guidance, which would be very helpful, there's a huge resource. I think Charles touched on this in his introduction, in that there are hundreds of thousands of people who really care about heritage, millions of people who care about heritage. There are some programmes, and these could be boosted and encouraged, to help residents, help civic groups, help neighbourhood forum, get involved. They can do character assessments. It's not rocket science. It takes a lot of time on the ground, but it's something that absolutely everyone can get involved in. And that
amenity society.
Yeah, that could be a really good way to embed them in the process and put them at the beginning of the plan making process, rather than only coming in at the end and being consulted on.
I know Croydon did this with their conservation areas, locally listed, or LASCs, local areas of special character, but it did take them sort of 5 or 6 years. So it's, by the time you've done it, this is going to be out of date and another one's going to come in. So it's the timing issue. I think it's great, and that's what should be done. Getting local people to buy into this and have their own respect for their own areas, because one of the things with small changes is you've got permitted development rights, things like people putting in crossovers, taking out their front gardens, which is all okay. They can do that. They don't really need planning for that. That will change the character of an area, in a decade, gone. So what was a conservation area for a reason is now no longer. So, even with the incremental changes that are allowed, can destroy areas.
Can I just give an example of the local work you can do in this area? I live in Hammersmith. I sit on the Hammersmith Leaders, Hammersmith Residents Working Group, and we've been brought in to work with the planners on a master plan for Hammersmith. And that has involved looking at the historic environment, and a big firm of consultants were involved where they identified every listed building and then said how the place had changed. But they didn't actually evaluate the buildings that are there. The ones that are partially in conservation areas and not in conservation areas. So we said from the start, as the lay people on this group, but surely the answer is to go through King Street, the main street in Hammersmith, and look at every building, look at its history, look at what's left of it, and say, well, this one's worth keeping and this one's not worth keeping, or this one has this amount of local significance. Now, the council haven't done that, but we as the Hammersmith and Fulham Historic Buildings Group are now endeavouring to set out to walk down King Street, to use the local archive and what resources we have to produce a study of King Street. So we are informed, and the council is informed, about the local importance of a number of the buildings. We're not talking about listed buildings here. We're talking about buildings of local interest. Victorian terraces, are they worth keeping? Have they been so badly altered that maybe you should be thinking about redevelopment? And that then gives you the answer to take back to the master plan and to the developers about their sites.
It would be a great reassurance, particularly to the outer London boroughs, for the GLA to acknowledge that intensification doesn't necessarily mean tall buildings. I think there's a lot of concern about tall buildings and how this would change character. And as I've said already, I mean, you can get quite high densities looking at historic areas with the pattern that traditionally we have: mansion blocks, squares, terraces, and all the rest of it. And it is perfectly possible to do that. Simply, look at the centre of Paris, for instance, which is much higher density than London.
Do you get many mansion blocks in the outer London suburbs?
No, but we could do. That's what I'm suggesting. Yes, what I'm suggesting is that we look at the model, the template of the historic environment, and think how we could apply it to certain parts of the outer London boroughs. And it wouldn't be high rise, and it would be civilised urban living, which I think would be very satisfactory. And of course, it's much more sustainable, mixed uses and so on, with everything attainable in a short compass.
I think one of the things that we've had in Kingston recently was a mansion block put forward for Tolworth, but sort of on steroids. It was, 11 stories, which is not
a mansion block.
And they take the typology of a mansion block and say, this is a mansion block, this is optimising a site. And so you have to then balance that whole, well, it's not a mansion block, but,
it's into character.
And this is one of the issues. You'll have typologies that people will try and take from central London and plonk into a suburb where it doesn't work, and there must be a different way of densifying that site. I mean, we will see a lot of house extensions, a lot of splitting of houses, which traditionally, people have bought because they want a 4-bedroom house, but then they don't want to move out because it costs too much, therefore they'll convert. Then you have a lot more strain on that house and the services within that area. So things like bins, you go from one house that had one family in it having 2 sets of bins, or 3 sets of bins, or 4 sets of bins now, because you have to recycle and everything else, and then you split that into 2, you've now got 8 sets of bins, and all of those little things then also change the character of that
and
street.
parking as well. That parking, all streets just covered with parking. You can't even see the terrace. You can't see front gardens. You can't see front boundary improvements. So
Go the drives and you got the bins.
Exactly. So it's the incremental changes as you were saying before.
That would be huge impact on
Can
the
I
sites.
ask Mr. Cook whether or not you think the London plan should make a requirement that developers should come forward with a low-rise proposal first before they produce a high-rise one?
Yes, I think I probably do. I defer to my colleagues who've got more working knowledge now.
I mean, the other way around, though. They always come up with a bigger building, and then we negotiated it to a down.
Well, the problem is, of course, is that those negotiations sometimes aren't successful.
And when we ended up here.
No, I think this question is very important and comes up every time on other planning
Mr. English, you were
commissions.
about to...
I was just going to say, on the Tall Buildings Policy D8, there is in part C, subsection D, that kind of justification. So it says proposals resulting in harm, and this is purely to heritage, will require clear and convincing justification demonstrating that alternatives have been explored and there are clear public benefits that outweigh that harm. I think what you're suggesting is that test, that alternatives have been explored, should be applied across the board, and it's quite possible that that type of approach, where people can see that there's a justification for why it has to be this way in this location to produce these benefits, would help convince communities that that was the right solution in terms of built form for that site. On a lot of sites, the density that you get is relative to how you draw the boundary, and you can tweak that more or less.
I think that what I'm trying to get to here is that developers of tall buildings will always say that's the only way we could get those kind of density,
I think that's
without trialling any other alternative, and that's my concern.
For me, what I see come in is it's all about viability, and I say the first thing I say is I don't care how much you paid for your site, but I think something like that should be in there, like actually viability to the historic environment or any built environment, doesn't matter. That's your issue. If you've overpaid for that site, then that's the built environment shouldn't pay the price for that. And I think that's what happens a lot. And that's what it comes down to. It comes down to viability and affordable housing. And then it's a balancing effect, an effect that always results in housing winning. So that's the problem that
we see collectively see this London Plan as yet another opportunity to make sure that high densities or intensification doesn't mean automatically tall high-rise buildings, and that is where this sequential test or ability to prove or requirement to prove that they've explored other options before coming to high-rise solution. There's enough evidence, and Sunand Prasad, for example, architect on the panels, has consistently said the same thing, that we'd like to see alternatives produced before promoting high-rise buildings.
The whole Assembly has put that forward as a recommendation.
So that is kind of what you'd call sort of cross-party kind of approach here. That's what we'd like to see happen. That's what we've heard from panelists as well. So I would certainly want to see this London Plan does sort of carry through.
Yeah, I would agree with that. It's just goes back to the viability and the balancing.
Sure.
And I think that's always going to be the point. They'll come in and they'll go, yes, you can have a 4-storey building, but actually you're going to get no affordable housing.
But you can accommodate, which you can, in many instances, a medium-rise blocks.
Like 8 or 10 stories.
Exactly.
The less consensual position is you should ban the lot of them.
I mean, even 8 to 10 stories medium rise for suburbs is still quite high.
Can I just call us to order a moment and just say that none of you have actually said what is actually new in this plan, which is that local authorities are able to decide what is a tall building.
Yes.
Chair,
and then last week we had the Assembly member for covering Richmond saying, well, does that mean I can have 5 stories as my tall building? And it does allow for that. So, but it's going to be on an area by area basis, isn't it? But it does give enormous freedom to the...
we're probably very supportive of that, but depending on different members and different areas and residents, I think that is a positive. But also you've still got the optimisation and all those other things that and removing the density matrix, but also retaining standards as a minimum standard. You cannot have any pocket living or any of those types of things. Means you're not. They sort of go against each other. You're going to end up with a taller building.
But if you give the developers a clear message that they aren't necessarily going to be allowed their overdevelopment, then they shouldn't pay too much for the site.
Yes.
And that's when it comes down to it, it's all a question of what they pay for the site.
Very, very good point, which means boroughs have got to get on with defining what the range is going to be in different areas. That's if we don't have a density matrix.
So in Haringey, based on the characterization study, we are now working towards a tall building SPG where the main parameter is that if your building is 2-storey taller than the rest of the area, then you are looking at a tall building or taller building, because technically you would be able to see it from various views, whether you're not in a conservation area or in a conservation areas. So we have said that if you are
So when you say the rest of the area, do you
So
mean the
if
tallest building in the area, or do you mean sort of the average?
The average height.
Right.
So, for example, if you're looking at a Victorian suburb, which is about 3-storey townhouses, Georgian townhouses, Victorian townhouses, and if you're proposing a 6-storey building, then you will qualify that as a taller building.
Right.
That's the approach we have proposed. We've not adopted the SPG yet. We're still working on it, but that's the approach that we have.
I think that's quite interesting because actually in places like New Malden we've got areas where around the station which have 16 stories and next door is a 2-storey residential road. So you then go, well, what's the in between? And then you start to get this sort of mini Manhattan around the station, which in terms of the London plan is optimising your site, you're working on your Crossrail 2 stations, all of those things, but it is a huge change to the character of that area, which is literally next to a conservation area, so that you're impacting on the setting of that conservation area. Yeah, it's they sort of work together but also work against each other, a lot of the policies within here.
I think there's also, if you're a developer and you get your application refused, let us say, you want to take a view as to whether you're going to be able to get away with this on appeal. Yeah. So, I mean, I do think we need to have the policies couched in such a way that there's more strength, as it were, for the boroughs in fighting a case on appeal.
You can defend, on appeal. Chair, I think we've done my questions thoroughly now. Thank you.
Most of my questions are about small sites as well, but I think a lot has been covered. The terminology in the London plan is you can turn down a development on a small site if there's an unacceptable level of harm. What does that mean, do you think? What's acceptable? What's an acceptable level of harm?
Well, this is what I struggled with. I actually highlighted that word when I was writing my notes. Does that mean that less than substantial harm is permissible and substantial harm is not going to be permissible? That's a very weak word, I would say.
Is that even because I sometimes think that the London plan is just an employment project for planning lawyers?
I think that you've put your finger on the problem there. An unacceptable level of harm in a conservation area where the local authority has a duty to preserve or enhance, you can't have an unacceptable level of harm. So fundamentally, that part of the policy needs to be changed, or the following bit where it talks about the presumption should not be applied to needs to say all heritage assets, so that you're not automatically building in this kind of slippage of the levels of protection which exist in national legislation and in national planning guidance.
It also would give more weight to local listings, which I feel is sort of lost here, and we struggle to hold on to those because it's always outweighed by the benefit of more housing or whatever it would be.
But does it mean that if it's not a heritage asset and therefore has no significance in terms of this policy, that the rules of the jungle apply? I mean, I think you've got to be careful, and we're talking about heritage here, but we're talking about the character of London as a whole. So I think there's too much of a contrast there. If you can't argue significance in terms of particular designated assets, that in fact you've got no defence.
Without you all going into a huddle now to decide an alternate form of words, obviously it is a noble, a sustainable objective to build on small sites, to use those small sites. Can you think of better wording that might enable small sites to be delivered on a certain degree of presumption in favour of development?
Well,
how would you also at the same time?
You could probably say presumption should be in favour of development where it does not harm heritage assets.
Nice and clear binary position.
Yeah, does not harm, and then I don't know.
But that's already. I mean, I think
as well.
Yeah,
I think in fact.
Sorry, I missed that, Mr. Good.
Does not harm heritage assets or the local character.
You've got to add that because it already does include the heritage assets. It doesn't include conservation areas.
Local character.
But it's about this unacceptable.
Yes, I think
am I right in saying that there's a consensus that the word unacceptable is unacceptable?
Yes.
In relation to heritage assets, definitely. I want, just taking a kind of slight step back with this policy, where it talks about local character evolving, in some places that's probably fine, and it does say inappropriate locations.
Yeah.
Where you then get the slippage is in the supplementary text, where conservation areas having been taken out of the actual policy box, paragraph 4.2.7,
Right.
which it's got some wording to try and soften soften the slippage in terms of the conservation areas being made targets for the small sites policy, for the demolition, for the conversions, and for the infill.
Oh, yeah, thank you.
You could, if you just take designated heritage assets out of this policy, actually have something quite positive, which I think Nikki picked up on this, that you do have backland sites, you do have buildings which have been left to rack and ruin, which become eyesores in conservation areas. You could have something in that paragraph which is quite positive, that local authorities should seek out opportunities in conservation areas where they can enhance character through this type of development.
I've kind of experienced too many instances of where landowners have deliberately derelicted their own sites. So I'm not sure that would, well, it's your evidence, not mine.
I think it's very important for people to understand that a conservation area is something where change is permissible, provided that it's, as it were, enhancing. So if you've got an element that detracts from the character, it's a positive advantage to change that. And therefore there's always scope for change in conservation areas. I mean, people like to characterise it as, I mean, the famous politician's remark is preserving an aspic, isn't it? Every politician, it seems to me, when they talk about heritage, also mention aspic. But there's always scope for change.
So you're saying that this general thrust of the plan, that development needs to take place everywhere except Green Belt, isn't necessarily a threat to conservation areas. Is that what you're saying? Yeah.
If you can get the wording right, you can use it as a positive tool. You need to exclude heritage from particularly conservation areas, in this case, because it's very relevant to these policies which talk about demolition and infill, because these are areas where they have special character. In terms of the whole of London, it's actually a very small proportion of London which is conservation areas.
It looks huge on the map.
It's not really. The gaps in between.
I know.
You know, it's like the gaps between atoms. Inconceivable. Anyway, so yeah, I think I've covered my positions. Anybody else want to say anything about small sites before we do tag team with?
Just principally that the NPPF does recognise that every part of a conservation area is not the same value, and does encourage local authorities to look at parts of the conservation area where they could actually carry out development that could potentially enhance the conservation area. That's in paragraphs 137 and 138. So there is an encouragement that we should be looking at conservation areas in terms of development to get good development in there that could potentially enhance the special interest of that.
I think there would be work to be done on conservation area appraisals and the management of,
those
areas, and then it goes back to
the
resources.
That's where the gap is, the resources.
And I think
so many
would,
London boroughs haven't got up-to-date conservation area appraisals. In fact, many of them still rely on the designation document that they did at the beginning, which is often very scant.
If you can find it as well, because we can't find ours.
Yeah. I mean, it's exactly the same with listed buildings, because you don't even need to list a building consent if the alteration you're making doesn't affect the special interest of the building. So people don't understand that. They think if it's a listed building, you can't do anything to it. It's not true.
That's why you have listed building consent, so you can make changes.
That's right.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Nikki.
Right, Nevin?
Yeah. I've got a question pertinent to strategic views. We have already kind of touched upon this during our discussions. The strategic views policy is largely similar to what we currently have. But should the strategic views policy be firmer than what it is now? David?
There is a new paragraph which has been put in response, I think, to the development referred to in the question, which is the one in Stratford, which affects a view from Richmond Park.
Yes.
This paragraph is good. It clarifies about development in the background of views, whether it's in the assessment area or not. So that's welcome. That's slightly firmer. We've talked about implementation before, and I think that's the key thing. It's making sure that the next version of the London Views Management Framework, which is the supplementary planning guidance which flows from the London Plan, that has the right words. And again, it touches on things like 3D models. And I think you spoke in your last planning committee about 3D models. There's some mentions of 3D models in the plan, including in relation to World Heritage Sites. Obviously, we're a little way off them being common practice, but the plan could take a bolder position and really push this as a very useful resource, if that was considered helpful.
Are for us the right bodies to define what a tall building is? Going back to, again, conversation we had before pretty much. Should the mayor be doing more and be setting a strategic vision for London skyline?
I'll kick that one off as well, if that's all right, and just say that the views policy isn't a skyline policy. By defining where development isn't permissible, it effectively says there are lots of areas where development is permissible in terms of the skyline. To manage the skyline, you would need an urban design approach rather than a heritage approach. And I think the one point that I would make on that from a very heritage perspective is, at the moment, the views policy really focuses on the visibility of St Paul's Cathedral, Palace of Westminster. These are the key defining features of London to the nation and to the world. And if you were to have an urban design-led policy, regardless of how you got it to work on the ground, in terms of tall buildings or large buildings, how would that present London to the world in terms of the skyline? Would you still make those key landmark features the defining features?
When we talk about London, it's so much more than just inner London, where one generally talks about skyline, protection, enhancement, call it what you like. Then you got outer London areas. You got large mayoral development corporation, Old Oak Common, for example, coming along. Should the skyline approach or urban design approach not cover those suburban outer London boroughs as well? And this is where, fine, yes, boroughs are being asked to look at what their definition of what their policies for tall buildings are. But should there not be a strategic vision, and then that's reflected in London Plan for all of London from the mayor's side of things?
Sorry, did you want to?
I was going to say I think it should be locally decided myself.
I agree. I think the London Plan already talks about the opportunity areas, for example, Old Oak Common, Tottenham, Wood Green. It has already identified the areas where it sees as opportunity areas, and I think we expect at a borough level that those opportunity areas will change in character immensely. We're already looking at Tottenham Hale as a cluster of lots of tall buildings, 30 plus tall buildings. We're looking at Wood Green as a cluster of tall buildings, 2 mini Manhattans actually, stepping down to the residential suburbs. And we have given that in our area action plans, and our urban characterization study actually highlighted places which could be suitable for tall buildings, where we think that right opposite really main railway stations, future crossrail railway stations, where it would be possible to accommodate really, really tall landmark buildings, but just the ones. In places we have identified just one tall building, in other places we have identified a cluster of tall buildings. So I think at a borough level, up until now it has worked.
Yeah, for me, I think the opportunity areas, I think it goes back to them not having to be tall buildings. They just have to be a higher density.
Yes, yeah.
And I think that's something that could probably be drawn out more. And I think the issue that we'll face is by having an opportunity area, people will put land values on that because there can therefore be a tall building. But I think if there's more pressure on it being a higher density rather than being a tall building is not necessarily the answer.
Yeah. So mid-rise, high density.
Yes, you don't have, just because I find this very interesting, listening to Haringey, because you don't necessarily, unless you're going to go above 30 stories or something, you don't necessarily have to have a tall building, do you? I mean, you could get just as good density out of the site by going for different configuration.
I think I know you're going to answer, but I think in the suburbs you have a lot of landowners, so you don't have that sort of site that one person owns quite a big site to be able to do that on. So and people don't want to sell their sites to someone else, so you end up having more tall buildings. I don't know whether that's something that I think we see.
Well, in Haringey at least, we've managed in Tottenham Hale for developers to work together for a master plan in land assembly sort of way, so that we can put a cluster of tall buildings on a particular site and more open spaces and mansion block style typology in other, and then there has been a cross subsidy, and which at least in Tottenham Hale side it has been partly successful. I know it can be very difficult to actually achieve that practically, because there's always developers saying, why are you allowing 35-story there in the master plan and not on my side? Why is there a big park on my side? But I guess it all comes down to how you then work with the developers in making sure that the master plan, the area-based master plan, actually goes down to those details. And no, I didn't definitely not mean that opportunity areas mean tall buildings. I think opportunity areas definitely mean high density, but it is about achieving, in Wood Green and Tottenham, the land values are really, really poor. You do not get a good scheme, a viable scheme, like King's Cross did, I guess. King's Cross, the land values were so high that they were able to achieve without going to that level of high buildings. But
I think borough-wide characterisation and 3D modelling are a great exercise for councillors when they're looking at proposals anyway, because it's so easy, if you don't have those devices to hand, to be seduced by the architect's drawings of people enjoying cocktails under striped umbrellas and all the rest of it.
So this is a GLA and Mayor's sort of 3D offer.
I think that's really important, but that's the only place that I see the 3D model being mentioned within the heritage stuff is within the World Heritage Sites. It doesn't form part of a policy. I think every borough should have a 3D model, and they should have to look at it when they're assessing applications.
If it doesn't, that's something we need to pick up.
It does in the design policies for area-based master plans, etc. But as we were talking before, perhaps it needs to be strengthened to a borough-wide characterisation along with a 3D model. I think that needs to be
borough-wide characterisation. We're going to have to wrap up.
I just need to move on to a topic we haven't discussed at all, and that is question to Michael. The Thames Blue Ribbon policies have a lower profile in this plan than previously. Is the River Thames being adequately protected in the new waterways policies?
Well, I have a particular point that I think I made to Nikki before, is that it seems to me that the Thames is a very important part of London's USP, no question. And the character and appearance of the river, a lot of it's not just to do with the buildings on either side, it's to do with the river traffic. And that river traffic needs to be serviced and looked after. And what has tended to happen is that policies for building alongside the river have obliterated quite a lot of the framework of small sites that used to service and repair the river. So riverine activities need to be looked at very carefully, I think is what I'm saying.
And does anyone have a view on the what's been a policy more or less, which is to have very tall buildings alongside the Thames, particularly in the central part of London?
Well, I think the real problem, of course, is if you look at them, half the buildings have no lights on at night because they're just not occupied, and you think to yourself, well, here's an opportunity that has actually been wasted, but that's just a personal view.
Because if they do you think the policies are strong enough on the river
Yes.
in relation to the built environment alongside it?
Well, they haven't been strong enough as far as World Heritage Sites are concerned, have they?
Yeah.
I mean, it seems to me that the developers have run rings around both the, well, certainly against the statutory bodies who are meant to advise, like Historic England. I mean, it seems, and UNESCO have been rightly threatening for many years to dire consequences. It always seems to just disappear, but it is a problem. I'm absolutely sure that what has happened in the setting of the Westminster Palace World Heritage Site has been pretty outrageous.
As an observation, in terms of the position that the Thames is getting in this plan, I think what's in the box, in terms of the policy, and what's not in the box is really interesting. Paragraph 9.14.4, the River Thames is a strategically important and iconic feature of London. That's not in the policy box. And
Which policy box would it be in?
it would be in SI 14, which is about waterways and their strategic role.
Right,
So
again,
there's something there which there is an opportunity for the Mayor potentially to show some leadership. It talks about Thames policy areas. It talks about the things which need to go into the strategies for the different Thames policy areas. There are various strategies from Hampton to Kew, Kew to Chelsea. Then you've got a gap in central London, and this has existed for a very long time, that there isn't that detailed work that's ever been done. You have to go back to the 90s, I think, when John Gummer was at the Department for Environment, and there was some quite clear guidance on things like tall buildings next to the river and the effects that you should try and avoid in terms of good design. A lot of that got swept away at kind of early days of trying to promote a few tall buildings in central London to kind of show that London was open to the world.
it's the thresholds.
Exactly.
There are strong thresholds about heights in central London.
But there's something there in terms of
They're
that
overshot
work, which
all the
which
time.
could be a really positive contribution to how the river's managed, how the area around the river's managed. And as we think about London becoming a 24-hour city, the river is one of its best assets. There are projects like the Illuminated River Project where they're looking to bring people into the river at night. That's fantastic. But marrying up that kind of cultural activity, how it relates to the built environment, how the built environment relates to this wonderful resource, which is full of nature, full of heritage. There's an opportunity there for the strategic authority to bring people together, because you need that bringing people together to make it work. It's so complicated with so many different interests, and it's such a big space that a borough can't do it, and a civic group can't do it.
I think one of the things, I don't know much about this policy, but one thing that it doesn't talk about is opening it up to public access, which I think should probably be within that policy. It's about the accessibility to that riverside. So regardless of whether it's a tall building or not, it's the accessibility to that asset that should be within that policy, because that's not drawn out at all, and that's one of the most important things.
This is all helpful.
So on that, I'm told that Nine Elms, the sort of promenade along the tide of the Thames is basically as small as they can get away with.
Yeah, which I think is bad.
You know, which is a tragedy.
Yeah,
really.
and the thing that we found there, we did a site visit there, was actually the tall buildings have created a lot of wind around them, so actually the enjoyment of that public space, which is already very narrow, needs to, tall buildings need to be dealt with in terms of their wind tunnelling and the enjoyment of those spaces.
Can I say that the plan does talk somewhere about a canyon effect, which has happened in central London, and none of us want that to set a precedent for further developments. And I would just urge you to write in, if you can, because we have to close this panel now, to write in, and if you can spot ways that we can actually strengthen the policies in the plan on the Thames, because I think to a certain extent London's turned its back on the Thames.
And also you're saying all the right stuff, which kind of helps us.
Yes. So if you could do that, and as I said earlier on, and as Tony Devonish said, if there are, if there's evidence you want to give us, tighten up policies, then do send it in to us. And I presume that you'll all be making your own individual responses anyway.
Chair, can I make a very quick comment?
Yeah.
Particularly to English Heritage, will you have on your website the fact that we have this consultation going on, the London Plan consultation? Will you be able to push this out to your members to get more people, more stakeholders to really get involved in the process?
I'd say we've been actively promoting this consultation for about 18 months, 2 years now. We've put lots of information up on our website that people can look at and engage with, and we're working with other partners in the sector to make sure that everyone is aware of it.
Thank you.
All right, well, thank you very much to our panel of experts. And we're now going to bring up our second panel on open space. You're very welcome to stay if you want to.
It says Green Party, actually. We've just been promoting them. Mind you, I've been promoting the European Union as well.
Do you know, I once had a... You might have been there. On the bottle.
Did you see that? Attacking.
And everything on the other side is last night. Not trying to do anything with it. But they all right.
Very good. They said all right.
She knows that. She knows. Yes.
All right, start. Thank you. You've seen the standard story.
Right. Are we ready, panel? Okay, those who are watching on the webcast, we're now about to begin our second investigation into how our panel of experts are viewing the policies on, and it's not all the policies, of course, we are trying to drill down a bit on London's open space. And I'd like the panel to just introduce themselves to us and to the world, starting at the right-hand side. Thank you.
Right, okay.
My name is Jeff Neslin. I am the Development Manager for the London Playing Fields Foundation.
Hello, I'm Alex Welsh and I'm the Chief Executive of the London Playing Fields Foundation.
Good morning, I'm Tony Leach, Chief Exec of Parks for London, the new name for the London Parks and Green Spaces Forum.
Morning, I'm Simon Lee. I'm Chief Executive of Wimbledon and Putney Commons.
Good morning, I'm Matthew Frith, Director of Conservation for London Wildlife Trust.
Hello, I'm Kate Ashbrook, General Secretary of the Open Spaces Society, and I'm also a trustee of the Ramblers.
Thank you all very, very much. Now, I just want to say what I said to the last panel. We only have an hour, we have to be all of us have to be very succinct. We're not making statements, we're really trying to see how the plan shapes up. We want to hear what's good about it, but we also want to hear any ways you think it could be improved. And we're very keen to get actual evidence. And afterwards you could write in if you want to add to what you've been saying. So if I just sort of kick off, and I might start by asking Matthew this first. There's the plan has an ambition of the mayor's that by 2050, which is quite a long way away, that London's London should have green cover of more than 50%. What do you understand by that?
The way that we understand it is that it's going to be a mixture of the complexity of what we call our green and blue infrastructure. That includes existing semi-natural habitats, parks and open spaces, gardens, but also some of the green infrastructure that is being delivered on roofs, walls and buildings, and other infrastructure such as the green bridge over Mile End Road. You know, those kinds of examples. And it'll be a mixture of spaces which are accessible to people and those which aren't accessible to people but perform a variety of functions to benefit the well-being of the city. So in terms of biodiversity support, mitigating against the impacts of climate change, providing beauty and ornament, all those kinds of things which we treasure in terms of our green spaces. I think the ambition is absolutely laudable and we support it. I think the delivery of it is going to be highly complex and requires significant rigour within local authority planning departments. There's an issue that concerns us that there was a piece of work that City Hall commissioned a couple of years ago, Planning for Biodiversity. It's at the very bottom of the page on biodiversity on the mayoral website under the environment pages. And it looked at the number of planning applications which come into London via the local authorities, which in 2013 was about 85,000, and the percentage of those which were scrutinised for their impacts on biodiversity, and there was 1%. Now we know that the majority of planning applications in London are for loft extension, loft conversions and extensions into gardens, etc. But looking at 4 boroughs and the planning applications over the course of the year, the study, which is undertaken by Green Space Information for Greater London, and we were on the panel of that, suggested that 18% of planning applications in London have an impact on biodiversity in some way, and yet most of these are not being picked up in terms of providing the evidence base for which local authorities can then make an informed planning decision. And that's the issue that we struggle with at the moment, is that there is not, in our view, sufficient expertise within the planning system to make informed decisions. Now, that's not necessarily to say that that means that every development has to be sort of refused permission because of its impact on biodiversity, but how that development is permitted or not, and the mitigation that may result from that, is that there's an informed decision process within the local authority. And at the moment we have concerns that whilst the ambitions of the London Plan are absolutely laudable, delivery through the local authority planning departments is hindered because there is not sufficient expertise. And this is something that we have raised at previous Environment Committee investigations into the biodiversity strategy, for example.
Right. Can I just wind back a little bit, because I think more of what you said actually will be able to be dealt with in subsequent questions, especially when we look at perhaps small sites and what the impact might be on biodiversity there. But the plan also talks about green cover, doesn't it?
Yeah.
And it talks about no net loss of open space. Is that correct?
Yeah.
And but it also talks about green cover, and the over 50% includes, of course, green cover.
Yeah.
And I'm just wondering whether you're convinced that the green cover is going to make up for the no net loss of open space.
Well, again, it depends.
Achievable. Is this going to be achievable?
I think it's potentially achievable if we are, and collectively we, recognise that there's a difference between what I would call open space on the ground, which is potentially accessible and usable by people, and green cover which may not be accessible, but will perform the similar functions that green space provides to the city. And I think there is an understandable concern, certainly shared by some of our members and supporters, that the implementation, for example, of green roofs, which is good for potentially for biodiversity or surface water management, whatever, is not as good as protecting the open space that they may have replaced. And I think there is some justification in that, because I would say that providing greenery on roofs and buildings is a last resort. You know, the first thing that we should be doing is avoiding loss of green space in the first place. And if we can't do that, then that has to be mitigated and compensated for, either by provision of new green space at terrestrial level, or at worst, putting it on the roof or on the building, which at least provides some benefits for wildlife, perhaps, but not, broader, accessible benefits to Londoners.
Green cover includes trees, of course.
Yes, and I think there's clearly a very strong commitment within the plan, and certainly within the environment strategy, to increase the amount of tree cover. I think there's a general consensus that's a good thing and is achievable. And where that happens, I think there's still a lot of discussions about where that may be without causing impacts to other things like streets, for example. But I think there's a general consensus that tree cover will increase with concerted resource and political will.
Okay, and I haven't perhaps said this to this panel, but what we're really looking for is your take on what's in the policy box, and we need to make sure that if there's something that's said in the text that you really think ought to be in the policy box, because unless it's in the policy box, it won't have much weight. It'll be a material consideration, but it won't really have the weight of something in the policy box. So if something you think should be strengthened that's in the text, then you need to put it in the policy box. So remember that as you're taking us through your answers to our questions. Does anyone else, don't want to spend too long on this, but does anyone else want to come in on this ambition to have more than 50% of London being green, which includes green cover, which is really green walls, green roofs, and I think some of the vegetation in streets and trees, compared with open space. There's also a commitment to have no net loss of open space. So,
I'll come back with one more thing, Chair.
Anyone else want to comment on any of that? Don't have to. Jump in if you want to.
One of the key issues in terms of definition, but we're clearly coming at it from a playing fields perspective, which is about health and social well-being and sport and activity. And yet there's only 6.7% of the London area that is classified for outdoor sport. The definition on this area is incredibly wide. So the contribution of playing fields, not necessarily sites, but playing fields, is important, and that needs to be strengthened in some of the policies. The second thing I would say is about the disproportionate distribution of playing pitches in inner London.
Can I just say, we've got a whole question coming up on playing fields. So maybe we could wait.
Can I just ask?
Do you mind?
No, not.
We've got a whole question on that.
I don't know if we're going to cover this specifically in the questions that we've got, but we're likely to see a loss of back garden cover as a result of the new London plan, because of course it's removed any of those protections. What would this effect be, Mr. Frith, on biodiversity, on wildlife corridors, and all the rest of the wildlife uses of back gardens?
Well, back gardens are incredibly important for wildlife. There are 3.2 million garden plots in London. 24% of London's cover is gardens. And we know from a study that we undertook some years ago now, which looked at a dramatic decline in the greenery of gardens across London between 1998 and 2007. Although most of that was under the planning radar. This is people just paving their gardens and putting in decking and stuff like that. However, we do notice a shift in this particular draft London plan, which is looking at the suburbs dare I say it. And I think picking up on what the Chair was also referencing is the small green spaces, both perhaps within gardens but adjacent to gardens like verges and small kind of incidental bits of open space. And I think there are real concerns that at the moment they provide stepping stones for biodiversity if they don't at least provide habitat. Further accretion of further loss of gardens will have an impact on biodiversity. We know many bird species are dependent on them. What we don't have at the moment is, and we'll be saying this in our response, is an up-to-date understanding of the changes in gardens. The time span, as I said, we took now is now a decade, well, 2 decades ago almost now. We need to have a better idea of what's happening in gardens to inform planning policy. And I think that's a kind of notable omission in that respect, that we're basing planning policy on a very poor evidence base.
You're saying that the policy, that there are real concerns, I'm going to quote you, that a further loss of gardens will have a negative effect on biodiversity. And could you think of that particular section of the, do you think we should bring that section back in the previous plan that had a general...
Yes, I think there's a concern that we have raised in that certainly talk about green infrastructure has sort of focused on the public green spaces, and it's kind of said, well, gardens are something else and they're not really part of it.
Of course, a newt doesn't know whether or not it's public or private.
No, exactly. And of course, gardens are the place where most people have their daily contact with the natural world. And if we're kind of saying that actually that's not as important, then we have real concerns, not just from the physical impacts, but also what I would say the societal impacts of contact with the natural world. So we are concerned at those changes.
Mr. Leach,
can I just add, we think of back gardens because of the development, but I think there's the ongoing threat of the loss of front gardens to car parking, which is causing problems around flooding, issues of flooding. That I'm not sure whether it's picked up elsewhere within the London plan.
On that, it's an interesting point actually, because I'm always told whenever I say, oh, it's terrible how we're losing front gardens, that actually local authorities have the power to do that, but they just don't, they're just not enforcing it, or they're resource issues. I don't know if that's your experience or anybody else's experience, that the powers are there to stop back gardens being concrete.
The powers are there to deal with the porosity issue, where they don't deal with the vegetation. So you can still pave over you put a permeable surface down, but you can take out all the hedgerows.
So the powers are related to drainage rather than biodiversity. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Tony, do you want to come in?
Yes, might start with Mr. Leach if we could, please. Do the policies give enough power to the boroughs to identify new sites in areas of deficiency and deliver the required increase in open spaces and green cover? And if not, how specifically could they be strengthened, please?
I think there is to a large degree, yes, and these would be through the opportunity areas where there's greatest amount of new development. And I think by incorporating the urban greening factor, that is actually going to help the negotiations, that developers will have to be more cognizant of the wide range of benefits that green infrastructure provide. And I also am aware that there's a challenge map that's being developed as technology's moved on, that we can be very much more, we can hone down to where those areas of deficiency are, what kinds of deficiency, and how they can ameliorate things like air quality for areas where there's a big problem of asthma or whatever. So I think that is good, but I am a little concerned that thinking of where the policies could be strengthened, policy G4 refers only to local green and open space, and it says local in policy A of that. It says local green open spaces should be protected. my view is that all green and open spaces should be protected. And then following on from that, in paragraph C, talking about needs assessments, I think it's not just local green spaces, they're just a small part of the whole range of different size green spaces. I think all green spaces need to have a needs assessment if we're going to be able to build up a truly interconnected infrastructure of green spaces. So I think that would help achieve the areas of deficiency.
Is the needs assessment in the plan only applying to areas of deficiency?
No, I understand to be corrected. It's that boroughs have to undertake a needs assessment for the whole of the borough and be cognizant.
Every borough has to?
Yeah.
Yes.
Is that everyone else's understanding?
Yeah, that was my understanding.
Yeah. Whether they do it in the same way is another issue.
And whether there's actually joined up thinking between the boroughs is another big issue as to how that deficiency is then provided. And I think that's a key issue that needs to be looked at.
Well, are there recommendations for the plan?
No, I can't see those at the moment.
No, but what would be your recommendations? Because what we're after now is...
I think the green infrastructure strategy needs to be not just the borough, I think it needs to be the partner organisations or neighbours as well. They need to be working in partnership. I mean, one of the things that I'm concerned about in the plan is that you've lost the blue ribbon, the whole, that concept, which I think was quite well understood broadly about rivers, lost rivers and their whole part and parcel in London. And actually I think that by having done away with the blue ribbon, you've lost part of that overall context of green space and where that brings. I mean, we're working with the partners, South East Rivers Trust. They're doing some excellent work. There's other partnerships that have come into fruition as a result of the work, and I think it's a great shame that isn't strengthened. It's part and parcel of the whole green infrastructure.
Can I? This is a really interesting point, because we just looked at the blue ribbon in the previous in terms of heritage. Are you saying, I mean, the blue ribbon network, the term's gone. Yeah. Are you saying that the actual policies on the river have been diluted on rivers?
Yeah, I believe they have, and they're not as strong and at the forefront, and they're not integrated sufficiently.
Can you write that and give us evidence of that?
Yes, please. That would be very
Thank you. Because that's really important. Because we can't, you can change the name, but you can still keep. But you're saying not only is the name changed, but the strength, and it never was that strong, by the way. No. Was it?
No, but I think I can only repeat that. I think they are an integral part of the overall green infrastructure, and they're not coming out strong enough.
And the
protection
policy is at the end of the policies to deal with transport and leisure use, and sort of wonder whether the emphasis has changed.
Yeah. The emphasis has changed to what?
Well, the way that the plan is set out, it feels that the emphasis has changed. So it's focused on transport and leisure, and then finally there's a little bit about protecting our waterways, rather than waterways should be, protection of that should be first and foremost, and then how you want to deliver issues of transport.
It's strange, isn't it, since water quality and ecological corridors and
I think the corridors particularly
blue infrastructure is so important.
Yeah.
Right. So give us the evidence, please.
Fine.
Tony, is that?
Brilliant. Thank you, Chair.
Right. Tom?
Thank you, Chair. I want to turn to the what the panel's views are on the Mayor's urban greening factor model, and will this be sufficient to deliver the level of greening required and address parts of London that are deficient in green and open space? Who wants to kick off on this one?
I'll have a go.
Tell us what the urban greening factor is.
Well, it's the same as, but it's not the same. It's a similar thing to biodiversity offsetting. So it involves a bit of a matrix, which there is then a calculation based on what the building or the development is going to look like, what its impact is going to be, and then what are the kind of things that you might want to do to mitigate against the impact on the open space. And it's a model that's been trialled in Malmo and it's been trialled in Southampton, and certainly within the sort of partners working with the city, with the mayoral team, the idea of this green space factor has kind of gained some traction. But I think at the moment, our view is it's all in the proof of the pudding. It's all about how it's going to be articulated, interpreted and delivered. I go back to my statements earlier about where's the expertise within the planning departments to make an informed decision or be able to scrutinise what's... Is the applicant going to be making that green space factor calculation, or is the local authority going to be making that? Are the two going to be coming up with different answers? Who then makes a decision? There's some issues here about some of the references they refer to. So, for example, on ground cover planting, it says, see the Royal Horticultural Society's ground cover plants for overview. Well, it includes species there which are, if you planted them in the wild, you're breaching the Wildlife and Countryside Act. They're on Schedule 9 for invasive non-native species. So there's a bit of more work that needs to be done here. And I would, what we will be saying is that if this goes forward in the plan, then there has to be some very quite specific guidance that relates to the biodiversity, so from our perspective, the biodiversity of the locality in which this is happening.
Yeah, I agree.
So that needs to link to existing biodiversity action plans, it needs to link to the green infrastructure strategies that local authorities should be preparing, rather than this kind of off-the-peg references. Some of them really good, don't get me wrong, but they don't seem to have the sort of London view interpreted and put in place, and that's what we'd like to see.
I sort of heard nods of agreement or noises of agreement from you, Simon.
No, I mean, I think the concept is very good, and I think for each developer to have to look and consider, I think it all comes down, as Matthew has articulated, to the delivery, and will the planners understand, what is semi-natural vegetation that is woodland rich, how will they understand that part of the development? How does that link to the wider environment of the locality, and particularly back into those networks? And I think at the moment I've got a concern that this could be a tick box exercise that it achieves, whereas actually the premise of it could deliver a huge amount.
So good on principle, but needs more work.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Just add that I think it's a huge step forward, bearing in mind that some of the limitations. But I think any good developer would be taking a lot of these factors into consideration when they're designing. If they're not, they jolly well shouldn't be putting in a submission. But I think what it does is it gives you could argue just a tick box exercise, but it makes sure that every development looks at every aspect of this and things aren't missed off. And just close to the bottom is something about permeable paving. Something as effectively insignificant as that can be enormously significant, and it will help everyone to be approaching designs and applications in the same way. So I
think it will change the way people think about what they're going to include.
Absolutely, yes.
Okay. Any more views on this, or any other questions from other members?
The only thing I would ask is, do you think that there should be a key performance indicator?
Good point.
Mm-hmm.
I
don't know how you do it. It's a good point. It's a very good point.
I haven't looked actually to see what key performance indicators there are for open space, but if you've got a plan there, somebody might just look and just see. We can go on mulling that over while we move on to the next question.
Right, and so my next question is first of all to Kate. Are non-designated informal open spaces threatened, and how can they be better protected by the London Plan?
Yes, thank you for asking that, because they certainly are threatened. They have no protection. There are a number of ways of protecting them, at least to some extent. The very best one is to designate them as village greens, which if the council owns it, then it's very easily done. It does need to be owned by a sympathetic landowner, and it can be done as part of a development as a quid pro quo, actually protecting the open space, rather than just saying to developers you need to provide some open space. You could say to developers you need to designate it as a village green. And just as an aside, what that means is not That's not just the traditional country village green you can visualise with the oak tree and people playing cricket and drinking warm beer and all that. It's any space either where local people can show they've used it for 20 years without being stopped and without asking permission, have used it for informal recreation, or it's a piece of land that a landowner voluntarily dedicates as a village green, even if it hasn't been used. And those little scraps of forgotten land that are mentioned in the plan, you know, some of them suffering from dereliction, actually people love them. People go and pick blackberries and walk the dog and children play, and those spaces need protecting, and one way of doing it is as village greens. It has been made more difficult since the Growth and Infrastructure Act 2013, when the government introduced a provision which said that if land is in any way threatened by planning, it's too late for local people to register it, and that had a retrospective effect and was, in our view, very nasty. But then, supposedly in mitigation, in the NPPF, the government suggested that there could be something called local green space, which authorities can designate as part of the local or neighbourhood plan, which does have some protection, but we're finding that inspectors at plan inquiries are actually not accepting proposals for designation. Croydon has literally thrown out 89 proposals this week, which is shameful.
Croydon Council?
Yes, Croydon. No, the inspector on the Croydon plan. I can give you the reference to all this. So that's not a strong designation, but it's better than nothing. The other thing that can be done is for local people to get it registered as an asset of community value, which can apply to spaces as well as buildings. So there are various things, but I mean, we really advocate village greens. And just while I'm...
Is that something the London plan should encourage?
Yes,
because
absolutely.
We talk about local authorities doing this, but this is something
Can I just ask, are there many village greens actually in London?
Yes, there are a number, but not many of the voluntary sort. Okay. But quite a number of people have registered village greens throughout London, and we can provide some examples of that.
There are lots of community-used spaces in London. Could they become village greens?
They could if
they've been going for 20 years.
Yes, if they've been going for 20 years, yes, they could, if they're not threatened with any sort of planning proposal. Or if the landowner is so minded, they can be dedicated. It does just give them that protection for all time. Under 19th century legislation, which is archaic, but actually says what it needs to say. You cannot encroach on this land, you cannot use it for another purpose. And local people actually are given rights of recreation there. So it's a piece of heritage as well, you know, it's a wonderful thing to do.
That's interesting. Tom, I was just thinking, following on from your question, could the London plan, because a lot of what's in the boxes, the policies, are actually for boroughs. And do you think the plan could then put a policy in the box about boroughs actually looking hard at ways to protect their non-designated open space? Because these are the small sites, you know, open sites, which are, I think, they have no protection in legislation. And they don't in the London plan either, do they? Do they? I don't think so. No. So perhaps we should be encouraging what means there are to be included in a policy box.
Interesting KPI, Jim.
Oh, yes.
Well, it'd be a KPI, but first of all, you've got to have a policy.
Yeah.
Got to monitor something. What do you think, panel? Experts?
I just downloaded the application form. I just thought I'd let you know that.
What are you making?
Well, we've got one.
You're going to register one now?
Yeah, while we're speaking.
Right, anyway. Are you saying yes or no, Kate?
I'm saying yes, please, yes.
Okay, right.
You know.
Well, then would you write and give us some evidence?
Yes.
For us to put it and tell us where the policy needs to go, etc.
Yes.
And the accompanying text.
Please
justify
be really specific, the better. You know, with our officers, unless it's very specific, that will happen.
Okay. Okay.
I'll bring another panellist. So Simon, do you have any thoughts on this? How we can protect? Do you agree with Kate? Have you got any other thoughts on how the plan can protect?
I think policy G4. I think it's what Tony said earlier. I mean, you've given strong protection, of course, to Greenbelt and MOL, which but the G4 is weaker, and my own view is that you're going for no overall loss, but actually those small local green parks, open spaces are critical to the infrastructure. You know, they fulfil the table in terms of that local urban, the table in the designation of
8.1.
8.1, you know, in terms of that pocket parks, and they are, you know, the areas where there are play areas, there are small areas that people congregate, and I believe there should be no overall loss of those. Policy needs strengthening.
Do you think, while we're on table 8.1, do you think it's fit for purpose, this table?
It's been looked at so many times in terms of hierarchy of open spaces. I mean, it's difficult to know what you replace it with, from my perspective. But
well, also, you know, it's sort of, you've got one table which looks at the open space designations, and then there isn't a table, but there is a reference in paragraph 861 about the hierarchy of ecological sites. You know, and to me, the two are kind of integrated because, you know, there's a narrative here which talks about open space and as a kind of integrated multifunctional purpose, and yet the policy then splits them all up, and so you're not quite sure what the weight of one is compared to another. So there's an element there which I think is of concern. The other issue I just wanted to touch on, your fit for purpose and small open spaces. A lot of these strategies, green infrastructure strategies, and even habitat surveys in London have a minimum threshold cut-off point for survey because of the assumed complexity and cost of doing so. So it's often everything under a quarter of a hectare or is just ignored. And so therefore those spaces are not being looked at in their context, as Simon and Kate said. You know, they've fallen off the radar in the plans, so they therefore have white space value, so therefore they don't have that kind of rigour. And that's part of the problem, is that the open space strategies, going back to our comments about, it depends which borough does, they'll do it one way, another borough do it another way. I looked at two yesterday, and they both produce different kinds of approaches. But the small spaces, by and large, are the ones that are getting forgotten about us because the cost of doing that work, or the perceived cost of doing that work.
We don't find 8.1 helpful for playing fields because it doesn't make...
You say it?
London Playing Fields Foundation don't find
8.1
helpful for playing fields because it doesn't explicitly cover playing fields, because playing fields can pop up anywhere. You drive north through Woodford Green towards Epping Forest, there's a cricket square and Woodford Green in the middle of Epping Forest. So I think for us playing fields requires an extra box.
So you want an extra box for playing fields? Okay.
We do, and one of the things that London suffers from is a deficiency in playing fields. So we have 14% of the country's population, but 8% of the playing fields. And when you think London is this great sporting capital, you think football, you think Wembley, you think cricket, you think Lord's, you think rugby, you think Twickenham, and then you think grassroots, and you go, where? And what we have in London is a disparity in the distribution of playing fields. So you go to somewhere like Islington, and there are 4, but one of those playing fields is the Emirates Stadium. There's 215,000 people live in Islington. So where are they going to go? Well, they're going to go north to Barnet, where there are 115 playing fields. So it really needs its own box. And what we need to look at in terms of where we have a deficiency is what could we do for Islington? Well, we can create places to play sport and be physically active that previously didn't exist. And it's artificial turf pitches. So you look at somewhere like Barnet Park, it has a red grow at full size, it's brilliant. Local residents want to reduce it to a 7v7 because they think it'll bring all the hoodlums. No. You get a group of young people together on a street corner, they're causing trouble. You get a group of young people on a pitch, they're playing football. And that's what we need to do. We need to give, if we are really serious about improving quality of life, then we've got to make sure that we protect and provide those places where people can have a more fulfilled life through sport and physical activity. So, no, it doesn't help.
Okay.
It's a short answer.
No, I don't think it's fit for purpose. predicated on the London Planning Advisory Committee table of 1994. Yes,
All your fault. Mayor Cooper, but I have put the table here as a question.
Yeah. So it's good it's there as a starting point, but things have moved on, and it's limited to looking. It's great for looking at a hierarchy of green spaces based on their size, which is helpful. But actually what people are waking up to is that parks and green spaces, it's more than about size, it's about quality, and it's about multifunctional use. And it also includes proximity to people, which is very important. I think the missing part is the functions that each of these categories can perform, because clearly the larger ones can perform a huge number of benefits, and it's more limited with the smaller spaces. But when then this links back, because it is called on under section G4 about doing a needs assessment, you can do a much more intelligent needs assessment when you're looking at the multifunctional uses of green space. And this links very much to the environment strategy, which introduces the concept of natural capital accounting, where the benefits of green spaces in all shapes and forms are taken account of.
Would you send us, what your sort of ideal table would look like?
I can send you a starter for 10.
Excellent. That would be very useful.
Would if the LPAC put it in, then that means it's something that the London Plan can change. Then it's not something that is enshrined in national legislation.
No.
The mayor can do it, can he?
Well, I would think, I stand to be corrected, but previously it's had an acknowledgement of its source, and it has been changed from the original. If you go back to the real original, the wording has been changed, the catches haven't changed much, but it's limited, and it isn't an easy exercise to do. I don't pretend, but I think it will be far more useful to boroughs. And then I'm thinking, linking back to the whole concept of need for just playing pitches, just sticking with that. Of course, inner London boroughs have the hardest time because they're the most developed, and the limitation of each borough doing its own needs assessment and its own green space strategy. It's great that they do one, and they should, but there is a huge need for a more strategic approach, and that's where the All London Green Grid comes into play, which in paragraph, I have to find it right, 8.1.3 is suggesting that the Mayor will review and update the supplementary planning guidance. I think that's excellent, and that should happen, because that will help address some of the issues that Alex has raised.
Is that the policy box?
It's not in a policy box, no.
It should be, shouldn't it?
Probably.
Well, I think it's a mayoral commitment rather than a policy. It's a commitment.
Okay, maybe
I'm sorry, I have to go. I'm sorry, I have to leave.
Okay, yes, that's right.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for
All right, to you.
Thank you. That's a very important contribution.
I'll let you know how my village greener.
I think the Pan-London approach the strategic approach is very important, because while we have a needs assessment on individual London boroughs, what happens in terms of playing fields is there is a net migration from inner London to outer London, inevitably. So individual boroughs doing their own playing pitch assessments, which take a year and may follow Sport England guidance, but once that is done, this availability and update of that information is very poor, and we need. If you look back to 2006, the offside report that GLA produced then, it did an audit of all the playing fields. That's 12 years out of date now. So if we've got to move with the times, we need a pan-London approach that reflects people's movement in terms of the facilities that are there.
One of the implications, I think, Tom, of what's been said is that you might, if you went out to London Borough, say, well, maybe we can let a bit of playing field go but we'll let some of them go. But now we're hearing that strategically they play a very important role, which the particular borough might not recognise. But in fact, you know, we had that actually with Redbridge, didn't we?
In the 1980s, I sat on a committee that sold off bits of playing field in London Borough of Hillingdon, and I haven't felt clean since. You know, it was a real bad mistake, and I regret it. I've regretted it forever because it did miss that strategic view. Yes, they got a few houses on there, but
we manage 40 acres of playing fields within the Commons. They're increasingly being used by schools from inner London boroughs. They play an incredibly important role, and more so now during the weekdays as well. And this issue about underfunding, I know it's not necessarily one for the policy, but it is an important issue in terms of the council SIL policies, and it should be seen as part and parcel of the major infrastructure of the urban area.
So what are we going to say now? What needs to be put in the London plan then?
Needs to be some sub-regional thinking and planning, especially around the scarcity of funding and looking at joint borough projects. I mean, you look at Victoria Park, for example, you've got Hackney on one side, Tower Hamlets on the other, you look at Wanstead Flats, all strategic sites. There needs to be much more joined-up thinking. And a recognition that there may be people from outside the borough coming to play sport on your fields. And if one recalls the old Inner London Education Authority days, kids were bussed out to the outer boroughs because that's where the pitches and the fields were. So just as people come into Westminster to go to the theatre, people might go to outer London boroughs, to Hillingdon and wherever for their cricket and their football and their rugby and everything else. And there needs to be a recognition that people don't get their passports out when they cross from Tower Hamlets to Hackney and or Newham to Waltham Forest. When you're playing sport, people do that.
Is this an area where there's no net loss? You talked about AstroTurf. You can have new sites. Is this an area where you might get a trade-off? You might say, well, we'll lose this playing field here and we'll build AstroTurf over here. I don't know. Just want to...
Yeah, what we talk about is no net loss of pitches. Because there could be some enabling development, as you referred to, that might ensure that that site is future-proofed. There's a new pavilion, there is better drainage, it's more attractive. And when one looks at the difficulty in providing playing fields here, it's dominated by the 4 M's. One, we need to modernise them so they're accessible to all. We need to manage them so they do all the things that we're talking about, daytime use, weekend use, evening use. They need to be maintained so that the surfaces are attractive and safe. And they need to be marketed to reach the whole community. So it's important that we have that a kind of view which says no net loss of pitches, but we have to be realistic where sometimes the funding might have to come from.
I'd like Matthew to come in, because that might conflict with the ecological corridors, all sorts of things. Because you can have playing fields that don't have good drainage, but they actually...
No contribution whatsoever.
Are very
we have made comments about playing field or sports pitch proposals which are of artificial turf, not including the fossil fuel contribution in making those pitches, but also the impacts on drainage. And we're losing open natural green space in a very broad sense of purpose, which may during the day in the winter form a fantastic feeding place for redwings and field players before the footballers come on and play. And so we need to be mindful of making sure that the no net loss relates to the existing natural playing fields. There is always a role for AstroTurf. I'm not a fan of it myself, but because it's also happening in gardens, that's the other thing. Yes. What we don't want to do is a net loss of the porosity and the sort of the soils and the vegetation, the functions that they perform in terms of making London livable.
It's interesting because I mentioned earlier about London having 8% of the country's total number of playing fields. It has 15% of the country's AstroTurfs. Yeah. And there are something like 904 in London of varying sizes. But if it's a small AstroTurf at the bottom of some flats, and so the kids have something to do in the evening rather than go around doing other things which we might consider undesirable, instead they're playing football, You know, I think that when one looks at, 80 people being knifed to death last year, and if playing sport and being part of a team rather than a gang, for me it's a no-brainer. And we need to get that balance right, of course, the diversity, but artificial turf pitches do provide for that intensity of use 24/7.
Perhaps they could replace some of the lost youth facilities rather than the open spaces.
Yeah.
Anyway,
But the critical, Nicky, is in the management of them. It's not just, field of dreams, build it and they will come. That doesn't happen. They need to be managed properly so that they achieve all the wider social and health benefits that we want them to achieve.
Right. Should there be a KPI? Should there be some way of monitoring?
Absolutely. And I think Jeff mentioned earlier about the offside report. It's very difficult to protect and fully use what you don't know is there. And we've been saying all along that what we need is an up-to-date audit so that we can get a picture of what is required and how we can improve the accessibility of playing fields. But at the moment, sites might be lost, there might be some erosion, it might be a school site. There was 4 pitches when you were a kid there. You go back there 20 years later, there's a drama studio, there's a science lab. Now there are 2 pitches. The facility still remains, but the number of pitches have diminished.
Mm-hmm. How's Hackney Marshes doing?
Hackney Marshes is still the home of grassroots football. So it's still there. One of the things that we find disappointing about the plan, there's no mention of the Olympic legacy. It's only 5.5 years ago. We really need to be doing that. You talk about Hackney Marshes. London has more professional football clubs than any other city in the world. Why are we not doing more for grassroots? It's a dichotomy, isn't it?
We've got our pitches back now, haven't we? Because during the Olympics, of course, they used part of the Coach Park, which I thought was so ironic. The most used sporting facility in London, and they decided to build over it.
Well, I've taught and coached on East Marsh, so I know what you're talking about. And what we have to do is make sure that these places are fit for purpose. And sometimes what you see is a cycle of playing field decay where they're just left. They're underused, they're underinvested, they're undervalued, and all of a sudden they're under threat, and they've gone. And that's the pattern that you see time and time again. And what we would love this plan to do is to recognise that and to watch for signs of that cycle of playing field decay.
Yeah, well, can I just go back to the measuring point? You're saying, does the plan talk about facilities, and you want to talk about...
Yeah, it talks about sport and recreation facilities. We specifically want to talk about playing fields and pitches.
It needs to be included within it. I mean, 85% of all the playing pitches in London are owned by local government. Now they're under triple pressure.
5% owned by local government?
Yep, local government, education, or the health sector.
Well, that's why they're going.
Now that's a huge dilemma in the current budget position, where, because of the maintenance issues, it costs a lot and they're outsourcing them. The second one is that they can get a capital receipt if a developer goes there and uses it. And the third one, of course, is they transfer the asset to the voluntary sector who don't have the skill sets to actually manage it. The protection measures in the London plan that filter down to the local boroughs are paramount. So within the policy, the protection of playing fields is paramount. There is the Sport England role as a statutory consultee on that basis, and they have a 5-stage sequential test. And in the plan, it does mention that we need to look at Sport England and how they approach that. What Sport England would say is there needs to be a playing pitch strategy on a borough-by-borough basis, which, as we've already discussed, needs a more strategic approach for London.
Would you have some objective evidence to prove the contribution that playing fields have towards health and well-being and enhancing? I mean, you know, some technical
data. We commissioned some research a couple of years ago, ironically called Field of Dreams. Sorry. And we found that one site in Walthamstow, over a year, the activities generated on this 33-acre playing field was a saving of 4.8 million to the public purse.
Great, that's the
mostly in terms, and I've brought the report with me, mostly in terms of crime reduction, antisocial behaviour and health and well-being. Because what we wanted to do is to produce some evidence that playing fields really do those things.
Are you going to be submitting that independently to the London Plan, or would you like to submit that to us so that we can forward it?
We can do both.
We do both.
I think there's been three critical studies on playing fields, isn't there? 1977, 1990, 2006. And of course the parameters for measurement have changed over that period of time. So comparing the losses of playing pitches in London with what is currently there is a very complex matrix that if we did that in London and got a baseline position statement now, that would allow the plan to actually influence local boroughs in their deliberations.
We have a rather reactive fields at loss register. So when people are in their Ghostbuster moment, who they're going to call, they give us a call and we try and help them in terms of saving the site. And the most recent one's Oakfield playing field in Hainault, which is a fantastic site for grassroots football and cricket. And what we were able to do is use our networks and our experience to pull together all the bodies who would fortify the kind of strategy of the local Save Oakfield Playing Field Society. And thankfully, it was saved for sport.
I just very quickly on that, I just checked up what you were saying about Olympic legacy in the plan, and sure enough, it's not there. It makes you realise that legacy didn't last long, did it?
We did pretty well in 2016, though, so.
Just listening to all this, it does seem to me that, and Tom's got a question still related to this, that in terms of non-designated sites, like playing fields, that are not, and pitches that are not in Mull, Metropolitan Urban Land, because they are protected, aren't they? And small sites, there's quite a job to be done if we're going to have no net loss of open space. Quite a job to be done, and I think we should point this up in some way when we're addressing the London Plan in our consultation responses. Tom, did you have another question?
But there's one here, yes, to Tony about whether non-designated parks are safe from development.
Well, from what Nick has just said, no.
What can we do to make them safe?
Well, that's my earlier point, really, which is the policy for G4, which only relates to local green and open spaces. Yes. I think that's too narrow, and I would be so bold as to say all green space should be protected. And yeah.
Okay. And just finally, we're coming short on time, but the final one to Matthew: are ecological and green corridors sufficiently protected in the London Plan?
No, rather surprisingly, there is a requirement under the NPPF, I think it's paragraph 109, but I stand to be corrected on that, that requires local authorities to map out ecological corridors. And yet, when we look at the policy, and could argue it's to do with language, policy G6, part B says in developing development plan policies, boroughs should to identify green corridors. Now, the green corridor is not an ecological corridor. It is, I would argue, it's a subset. A green corridor could just be, and don't take this wrongly, a green verge. It could be a fantastically important playing field, but it's not an ecological corridor. And the MPPF was looking at this whole issue of trying to address biodiversity net loss and to secure net gain. And the ecological corridors that the local authorities should be identifying is not being specifically set out here.
So you wanted to say ecological corridors rather than...
Yeah, and I think it needs to, and in the supporting paragraph, it needs to reference national planning policy, because it doesn't do so. It talks about the legislative requirements in terms of these European and national statutory sites, and some of the wording there could be improved, but in terms of interpretation. But it's almost sort of taking it as an assumption that people understand what this means, and it's not recognising that there's more work to do. Going also to the point about undesignated sites and the small sites, which are of concern to us collectively, I think, is that they may then stand or sit in an ecological corridor. And whilst they may not be performing a great function at the moment, they could do with a change of management or an activity to improve them. And they, rather than looking at the space as it is and assuming that that's all it can be, that it could provide a football place, it could be a place for a family to have a picnic. At the moment, it's just a bit of green desert. It could be a nature reserve. It's those kinds of things, and looking at those open spaces as their potential. And there's not enough of that in here. It's almost about looking at stopping things happening rather than allowing, planning. The planning system should be looking to trigger improvements. There's an emphasis, there's a touch of that on an urban greening factor, but not enough.
It's in the spirit of what the environment strategy stresses very highly, and some of you have mentioned, which is the multifunctional nature of space. Matthew, is the environment strategy stronger then than the on-ecological corridors, than the London plan?
There's more, partly the environment strategy has more detail, and
But is there a policy that should be in the London plan that is pointed out?
We referenced in our response to the environment strategy about the fact that the ecological corridors were not sufficiently referenced.
In the environment strategy?
Yeah.
Well, so they need to be stronger in that and in the London plan?
Yeah.
Okay, if you send us the evidence.
Yes, indeed.
Well done, Tom. So, is that... That's it. I just wanted, because Wimbledon are here, Simon's here, yes. Commons. Yes. I just wondered, is there something you want to tell us about Commons that we should know about?
There's a leading question. Commons generally, Chairman, or... they're not referenced in...
but does the plan do enough to protect and promote?
No, I think there's there's been recently information released from Natural England regarding their strategy doesn't mention commons, so I think there is an issue missing in here about common and common land and its value as part and parcel. I think it comes down to this. I think a lot today is around that table and around the designation, but also about the qualities, and it's about what commons bring to that quality of open space, which is quite different from a built park and what that offers in terms of value, biodiversity, health, well-being. I take away from today the whole issue around the need. I think the green urban factors are going some way to start to determine future green space requirements, but we're not doing enough to look at what the existing green space requirements and how they benefit and can be added to in terms of enhancement.
I have to ask this question, even at risk of you throwing that glass at me. Do we need to protect them in the plan?
Yes,
we do. Why are they, you're saying there are insufficient protections for them without them being...
Common land, we're very fortunate at the Commons, it's protected by an act, others aren't. It's terribly important that those sites, they are the remnants of our former past, and they have to be protected for future generations to enjoy.
Good. So it needs to be in here, and it's not in here.
And you'll send us words.
We will.
That would be great if you could. And included in that is not just parks, but London squares as
Absolutely.
well. And
the historic. Yeah. All those small areas are integral to the fabric of London.
Great.
And Tony, you might want to say something about parks and public
Yes,
realm.
of course. Sorry, I beg your pardon.
Yep.
Of course you would, yes.
It's your job.
Yes.
Sorry. It's because he's got a description under it.
There's so much I could say, but
Well, you could write to us if you want.
well, I will be,
Because we're keen to strengthen.
and I'll be responding
All right.
formally. But I think what is encouraging is that whilst the London Plan deals primarily with the quantity of green space, it's supported, will now be supported by the environment strategy, which focuses on the quality of the green space. Because it's all very well protecting and preserving green space, but if it's really poor quality, that isn't a good thing. But the challenge to us all here is those decisions are decided at the local level, and the influence that the mayor can bring to bear on the quality of the green space is much more limited.
Thank you. And while you were speaking, I was just thinking the King Edward VII Memorial Park down which is tiny, small, but where it is, there's no other green around, and it's extraordinarily significant, even though it's tiny compared to Wimbledon. Yes. Thank you.
Panel, thank you very much for all your expertise, and as you know, we want you to work even harder by sending us your words, your ways of protecting and strengthening the London Plan. And also, it's good also to sort of signal what you think is strong and good and new. Do that as well, please. We'd very much like to have that. And so with that, thank you, members.
Thank you.
Oh,
it's been great.
Ozil, we've got to note the report, is that right?
And so can I ask the committee to note the report and the discussion and delegate authority to the chair in consultation with the deputy chair to agree any outputs arising from the discussion?
Noted. Okay, thank you. Thank you, Ozil. Thank you, Paul.
GLA, Committee Room 5, Sound. 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 GLA 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 Committee Room 5, sound. GLA, 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 Committee Room 5, sound.